My name is Jen Marvin. I'm the Florida Yards and Neighborhood Statewide Coordinator for FFL. I'd like to welcome you to the FYN Homeowners webinar. This time it's on garden design with Dr. Gail Hansen. If you have a question, please use the chat box, and Dr. Hansen will get to it when she sees it or at the end of the program. Please stick around at the end of our program for a survey. It helps me program a little bit better for you so that you can see the things that you want to see on our webinars. Let's see. So let me introduce Dr. Hansen. Dr. Gail Hansen is an associate professor in the Environmental Horticulture Department at the University of Florida, where she teaches the residential landscape design courses. Her teaching and extension programs focus on sustainable landscaping, urban ecology, and best design practices in residential and urban landscapes. She is also a faculty member in the Center for Land Use Efficiency, the faculty advisor for Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and the statewide extension specialist in landscape design. Dr. Hansen has an MLA and a PhD in landscape architecture from the University of Florida. So Dr. Hansen, please go ahead.
Okay, well, Jen, thanks so much for that introduction. I'd like to say good morning to everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and staying healthy, all things considered. So today I want to talk about landscape design, and I thought that it would be a really appropriate topic for now because I have been reading about and hearing from all my contacts in the landscape profession that everybody wants to design or redesign their yard right now. And I think a lot of people are thinking about it because they're spending a lot of time staring out their windows from their homes and wanting a nice green space to go to. So today we'll talk about the landscape design process. And I think in the announcement, it said that there were 3 P's to this, to landscape design, but we're actually going to talk about 5 P's today. We're going to go through the process that we use to do a design. We'll talk about people, developing a program, developing a theme for your plans, and then what you need to think about when you're selecting plants. So this is a big question that I get from a lot of people. They say, well, where do I even start? I even have to ask myself that question sometimes. A lot of times, and I'll be the first to admit that my backyard is kind of subpar. My excuse is because I don't have a lot of time to do anything with it. But a lot of times I'll go out, I'll get up Saturday morning, I'll go out and I'll look at my yard and I ask myself the same question, where do I start? And then I think about it's hot outside and I'm already feeling exhausted. So I just turn around, go back in and go get a cold drink out of my refrigerator. But there is a process that you can do. And the funny thing is that I get a lot of people who ask me, how do you come up with ideas for your design? And, you know, where do these ideas come from? And I even have had people ask me if I just wake up in the morning and the design is all in my head already. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of strange. And I thought, well, that might be kind of cool to just wake up and just have this, you know, design all ready. But then I thought, you know what, that's just way too weird. Because if you wake up and you have all this design and you don't know how it got there in your head, it would make you feel like somebody else is kind of controlling your brain. So actually, and that would take all the fun out of it too, if it just was up there in your head. So we do have a process. And when you have a process, it means that anybody can do a design as long as you follow the process. So where do you start? First of all, start with the people. And people might be a client if you're designing for a client, but they also might be yourself if you're designing your own yard for yourself. And so you're going to have some conversations with yourself if you're the client. You have to know about the people, who they are, what do they need, and what do they want. Once you learn a little bit more about the people, you can develop a program. So that's your third P. And then you can come up with a plan. And in this case, we're just going to talk about using a theme. And then last, think about the plants. And what you should do when you're thinking of plants is thinking about maintenance, the aesthetics, and the environment. So let's start with the people. When you are thinking about everybody who's going to use a yard, you have to think about the entire family. So especially if you have kids and other family members like your pets, you need to consider what they need or want in the yard. You have to think about the age of the people who are going to be out using the yard or just looking at it if that's your purpose for it. And then you also have to think about their interests. What would they like to do out in the yard? What kinds of activities might they like to do? And what would they need to do those activities? And the funny thing is that a lot of people now are thinking about wildlife, which is a good thing, thinking about bird habitat and butterfly habitat. That has become a very popular theme in landscapes. But when you're thinking about wildlife, usually people are only thinking about particular types of wildlife. I could say, for example, for the hundreds of designs I've done and many, many clients that I've worked with, I have never, ever had anyone ask me to design a snake garden. That's one wildlife, one critter that they usually don't want in their yard. But when you're designing for wildlife, you're also going to have snakes probably in your yard, and not just your really pretty butterflies and your birds. You're going to have visitors who are going to come to your house, and you may want to design to impress your visitors. And then the other thing that you need to think about is your maintenance crew. If it's your house that you're designing, you may be the maintenance crew. And so you have to think about, do I have enough knowledge? Do I have the skills? And also, am I physically able to do some of the maintenance that I might have to do in this yard? You also have to think about, am I going to hire somebody? If you're going to hire a maintenance crew, are they going to be somebody who's going to be able to take care of this yard? So those are all the questions that you have to ask about the people. When we do designs, it is primarily for people. Even if we think we're designing for wildlife, we're usually designing so that we can observe wildlife in our yards. So thinking about people is really important. And in fact, when I go out to a site, or my students and I go out to a site, we have a list that we take with us. And it's our client interview list. And we just check off all the questions as we are talking to the client. So we make sure we get all the answers we need. So now you've talked to your client, or you have had a serious conversation with yourself, and you have discovered everything that you need, but also everything that you want. And there's a really big difference between needs and wants. Needs are things that you have to do in your yard. For example, if you look at the plan below and you see the drainage feature there, maybe you have drainage problems in your yard and they need to be fixed because you might have water that's standing up against your house, or it's just not draining properly. That's definitely a need. And so that's something that you're going to have to spend your budget on. Your wants are things that you can do if your budget allows, if you have enough money to do it. Hopefully you won't have that many needs, things that you have to fix, problems that you have to resolve, and you can really do a nice design that concentrates on your wants. So wants might be, what activities are you going to do? Are you going to invite people over, have a lot of visitors, entertain outside? Are you going to cook outside? Do you need an outdoor kitchen? Do you need an entertainment space? What are the activities? Do you need a play space for your kids where you might put a little she shed or cottage for them to play in? Do you need a dog run? If your dog eats all your plants and digs holes in your plant beds, you might need to have a dog run, you know, a special little place just for your dog. You may need to have a work area, for example, in your yard. So those are all the activities that you want to do, but now you have to figure out, what do I need to have there to do those activities? If you want to have an entertainment space, you need that, barbecues out there. You might need an outdoor kitchen. You need to have tables and chairs. Um, all the things that will help you to have that entertainment space. So once you've figured out all the amenities that you need, then you need to figure out, how much space do I have to have that activity happen? For example, my parents have a bocce ball court in their backyard. It takes up a lot of room. It's long and it's, big rectangle. It's a lot of fun to play and everything, but it takes up a lot of room. So they had to figure out if they had room in their backyard to actually have a bocce ball court. So then you have to, go online and look it up and see how big it needs to be and figure out how much space you need and where you could fit it. So that brings us to the next step. You have to figure out how you are going to configure your outdoor rooms. So we think of it as rooms where different things will happen. Just like in your house, you have your kitchen, you have your bathrooms, your bedrooms, different things happen in those rooms. And same thing, outdoors, you have different things that are going to happen. In your dog run, that's really just for your dog. And that's the activity that's going to happen in there. They're going to have a place where they can, run around and dig holes to their heart's content. You might have to have a work area where you might have a potting shed, for example. You have maybe a little shed to put your work tools and so forth. You see a little outdoor room there in the bottom corner of the slide. Somebody has set up a nice little gathering area for some intimate conversation, and it looks like they plan to snuggle in with the plants there. So once you have figured out your spatial configurations in your outdoor rooms and you know where things are going to happen, then you can start thinking about the really fun stuff, and that's the style. But before you get to the style, there's one other point that I want to make about your program, and that is your circulation. And the circulation is sometimes an afterthought for a lot of people. The circulation are your pathways and walkways that you use to connect your outdoor rooms together. Some of them are very subtle. Outdoor rooms might be right next to each other and it might not be a need for a long pathway. Other times you might have it so your pathway is really the dominant feature in that area. I never used to think of pathways that way, but more and more as I do more designs, I use my pathways actually as a feature in the landscape. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because you need to have circulation, but you can also use your pathways as a really cool feature for your theme that you're going to choose. Because your pathways can be designed in many different ways. They don't need to just be a straight, plain, concrete path. You can do a lot of things with pathways that really set the tone for your theme or your garden. And so here's a couple of examples of a kind of a dramatic curved pathway up to the front door, and a large pathway, but it's big enough that it can also serve as small gathering areas. So let's look at plans. That's the fourth P in our process here. I'm not going to talk today about actually drawing a landscape plan because that's a whole nother topic and there's a lot of very specific things that you have to consider when you're actually putting that plan on paper. But what I want to talk about is having a guiding theme that will help you to make design decisions. So what is a guiding theme when it comes to gardens or landscapes? You have probably heard about all different types of landscapes. For example, an English garden or a Japanese garden or a Southwest garden, an arid garden. all different types of gardens. Well, those are themes actually that you can use to help guide your decisions. On this slide, I show two ways that you can start to think about a theme. You can relate it to the house and the architectural style of the house, for example. That might be your jumping off point to try to figure out what your theme might be. And or you can relate it to a particular garden style or type if the architectural style of the house is not very strong. But the most important thing you should think about is sense of place. Sense of place is just kind of like this common sense idea of I'm in a particular place, I live in a certain region of the country, and I should try to do a landscape that kind of reflects that region that I live in. You guys can probably tell when you look at these two pictures where the region of the country where that landscape is actually located. I think it's fairly obvious. When you look at the picture that's on the left, hopefully you think of kind of an arid desert type landscape. And if that's what came to mind, because you see some cactus there, you see some other kind of cactus-like plant material. This is actually a desert landscape in the desert Southwest. And you can kind of tell by the architecture and the colors also in the architecture. And then you look at the picture on the right and you say, well, you know, that's definitely tropic or subtropic landscape. So that could even be like in Key West, maybe, or somewhere in South Florida, maybe even coming up along the coast, east or west coast of Florida. But definitely has the hallmarks of a more tropical landscape with the palm trees and some of the broad-leaved plants that you see in the plan. So each of those have a definite sense of place. And I'm just going to assume that everybody who is on this webinar right now is somewhere here in Florida. And you could probably even determine a sense of place, a distinction between South Florida, Central Florida, and North Florida, just by looking at the plant material and some of the different designs. So we want to definitely have a sense of place. So I want to tell you a little story about a design that I did here in Gainesville. It was for a restaurant called On the Border. And so as you could probably guess, it was a Tex-Mex restaurant. It's a chain restaurant and they're located in Texas is where the headquarters are. And so they were opening a new restaurant here in Gainesville, the Tex-Mex restaurant. And so they sent me some pictures from Texas and their other restaurants primarily, and you can tell by the name On the Border, were in Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico. And they sent me pictures of the landscape that they wanted to replicate here in Gainesville. And as you can probably guess, there was a lot of cactus in the landscape, a lot of rocks, some kind of sagebrush looking shrubs. There was a big bleached bull's skull with long horns on it, a wagon wheel, an old broken down wooden wagon. And so they said, this is what we want you to do here in Florida. And I was like, well, you guys, you do realize that we are not in the desert Southwest. We're in a subtropical region, and we don't have bleached cow skulls and wagon wheels and big barrel cactus here. So we had to have some long discussions about that. And we finally figured out some plants that we could use here in Gainesville that look, kind of desert-like. And they actually packed up a big cow skull and sent it to me to put out in the garden. And they even sent a big old wooden wagon wheel. So they had to help us along with that design, but definitely it was not a sense of place here in Florida, but it was the theme for their restaurant. So let's talk about themes. So in themes, you have form, style, or type. So if it's a form theme, that's just the shape of the elements in the spaces. All gardens have form. So a form theme will apply to all gardens. And all gardens have form because everything in this world has form. You have a form. Plants have a form. Buildings have form. If we didn't have forms, we would not be able to distinguish items from other items. So everything in this world has form, which means all gardens will have a form. Style is that combination of specific characteristics so that you can recognize that garden. You can recognize a cottage garden. You can recognize a rock garden. It could be based on form, but a lot of it is often based on culture, like a Japanese garden, the English garden. Sometimes it's based on time. It might be a historic garden. You might be looking for elements that have some history to them. It might be based on a place, the desert Southwest, the tropical here in Florida. It could be the Pacific Northwest, a certain region or place. It could be based on plants and also certain materials. Again, with the rock garden, there's definitely going to be rocks in a rock garden, but then you're also going to have plants that are associated with rock gardens. And you can also have a type. So it might have a specific function. It might be designed to save energy. It might be designed to be a Florida-friendly landscape, or it might be designed to be a fire-wise landscape. So an example here is Florida-friendly. A Florida-friendly landscape is a sustainable landscape, so that's the function, but it could be any style. It could have a certain form, culture, time, plants, and it will definitely have form. So those are the three categories that we usually use when we're talking about a theme. So where can you get inspiration for a theme? Well, you can look at photos. That's where I usually start. And I have hundreds. I have databases with hundreds of photos of different gardens. And I still go online and look at different photos of gardens. So you can, if you are on Pinterest or whatever, look on Pinterest. You can gather some photos there. You can look at garden books, magazines. Garden Design magazine is a good one to look at. You can go to botanical gardens. There are really great botanical gardens here in Florida that you can visit where you can get some really awesome ideas for your yard. You can just go out and look at your favorite plants, and maybe they might be an inspiration for what you want to do in your yard. Go for hikes in natural areas if you want to do a more natural looking landscape, and that will give you some ideas. Maybe your architecture will give you ideas, or a favorite shape that you have. So there's a lot of places to go for inspiration and think about what you might want to have in your landscape. So let's talk about a little bit more in depth about some of the different themes. First of all, the form theme. A form is usually just geometric or naturalistic. Those are the two categories that we divide form into. So you can see on the image on the top there, the plan view image, you can see one where circular form was used. And I don't know if I can do annotate here, mouse. Right here on this one here, you can see the circular form is used here. You have a circular patio or a deck, a circular pool deck, and a little circular plunge pool. The one down here, it's a square or rectangular form. You have a nice little entry courtyard that's square. Your patio is square. Your lawn panels are square. And you have a little water feature with its own little seating area that's square. So definitely square upon square to kind of organize this particular one. Right up above in the picture here, you see a design that is all about squares. First of all, you have the entire shape of the garden is square, a long rectangle. And by the way, a square is simply a rectangle with equal sides. You have your pavers that are square, your stepping stones, and your little plant beds that are also square. Down here in the bottom left corner, you have the naturalistic design. So if you look at this, you'll see kind of some meandering pathways, a meandering dry stream bed there, and that was to solve the drainage problem there. You know, some kind of an oval shape lawn area there and meandering beds around it. So that's the difference between the geometric and the naturalistic forms. Okay, let me see here. There we go. So when we're talking about a style theme, we usually are dividing those into two categories of formal and informal. And the formal is using the geometric form, and the informal is using the naturalistic form. But the style can, again, reflect kind of the architectural style of the house. If you have a very old historic house, you might want to go with a cottage garden that has more of a historic feel to it. If you have, for example, a very modern, mid-century modern house, then you're probably going to tend to go more toward the formal design because the mid-century modern tended to use more, you know, circles or square form. You can go with more traditional, like the cottage style garden, and with more of a cultural aspect to your garden. But there's one really important thing for you to remember, especially if you're designing your own yard, but also for your client. Think about your personal expression because it's your garden and you want it to reflect you. And so I know at one time, for example, the plastic flamingos were kind of a cultural thing here in Florida yards. Now it's kind of a kitschy thing. It takes you back to maybe the 50s when they were really popular, or the 60s when they were kind of a cultural thing. But some people do it just for fun now, just as a kind of nod to the past in Florida gardens. You might want to paint a fence. If you really, really like wildflowers, maybe a fence that kind of speaks to your love of wildflowers. Perhaps a sculpture in your garden, and one that, you know, might speak to another love you might have. In this case, every time I look at that sculpture, I think of soft serve ice cream. And so if you're really into soft serve ice cream, you can make a nod in your garden to put that on a pedestal in your homage to soft serve ice cream. So here's your more formal geometric kind of style theme. You have geometric forms, obviously those squares, those circles, and so forth. You have repetition. That's really important in that formal design. Elements are repeated. There's probably fewer plants, though, than you might think that you would have in a naturalistic garden. They're used more strategically. They might be used as focal points or as part of that repetition. You usually have a very strong focal point in a more formal garden. So, for example, the image on the left where you have the fountain in the middle, it marks two axes that cross. And then you have some very strong raised planters there that also have straight lines and curves in them. You might find more traditional ornaments such as the fountain, a little bit more hardscape, and probably has more of a contemporary vibe, although you can look back at some historical gardens and you'll see, especially if you go to England or France, and you see a lot of very formal gardens that are very historical, and you see these kind of repetition in the shapes. On your informal or your naturalistic, you're going to have more organic shapes. You're going to have a greater variety of plants that are, they might seem to be more randomly placed, but they're not really. You still want to have repetition in your plant placement. You might have some natural water features. And then your pathways are going to probably appear or look a little bit more natural, more meandering and more organic. It doesn't mean, though, that your pathway isn't any more important. And in fact, a lot of times in a naturalistic landscape, your pathway becomes very important. It becomes an element or a feature around which you are going to organize your plant material. So you can see in the picture on the right, that pathway, which is just this really magical pathway that anyone would probably want to meander down, but it's a very, very strong feature in that design. And without it, the design might look a little bit more chaotic and not quite as well organized. So let's talk about a type theme. You remember we talked about having a specific function and possibly being like a Florida-friendly landscape or fire-wise design, or maybe it's designed for safety and security. So one type might be an edible garden. If you want all your plants to produce, edible fruits or vegetables, then that's a type. But it can also be a very formal garden. You could have groves that are in a grid pattern. You can have raised beds that are in a grid pattern that give it a very kind of formal feel to it, but you still can grow edibles there. SEPTED, that might be an acronym that you may not have heard of, but it is Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And really, to make that simple, it's usually used more for public spaces, but a lot of people do consider some of the ideas for their own private gardens. And it means having things like walls with gates that you can lock, and not having a lot of really big tall shrubs right by your front door so that you have a clear sight line and things like that. So if security is something that you want to consider, then you can think about very decorative ways to have more security, so it doesn't end up looking like you're trying to build some sort of fort. And you can see this gate here is a very decorative, nice wrought iron gate, and it really adds to the theme there, but it also adds more security. And then, of course, the firewise design. Usually in urban areas, we don't really have to be concerned about this, but if you live in a more rural area and have a lot of natural vegetation around your yard, you want to make sure that you have that 30-foot clear area all around your yard, so that you will be protected from, hopefully, from any wildfires that might go through. And then last but not least, there's the plant theme. And that's actually a pretty simple theme, and it's something that you might find it an easy way to come up with ideas for your yard, but it's usually based on a plant or type of plants. So this one picture is a photo I took at the Phoenix Botanical Garden in Arizona, and they have a really, really spectacular cactus garden there. And, a lot of times when you think about cactus, it might seem a little bit boring, but you might be amazed at the number of different cacti there are out there and the different forms that they take. And it's really spectacular in the spring when a lot of them are in bloom. The other picture up in the right corner shows a garden with succulents and aloes and different plants like that could be the foundation for your garden. You might include bromeliads, for example, into that garden. So you have a very distinct look to your plant material. And the one in the middle is actually a wildflower garden, with the exception of a couple of crotons that were poked in there, and I think there was some some crinum lily in that one also. But this was a project we worked on down in Sarasota, where we had people who wanted to do more wildflower gardens. So you can pick a plant type and base your entire theme on that particular plant type. So let's talk a little bit more about plants and how you can decide what plants that you might want to use. I always tell my students that the very first thing you should think about when you're selecting your plants is think about maintenance. And then you can think about designing for aesthetics and then designing for the environment. So, of course, they always say, but this is a design class. Shouldn't we put aesthetics at the top of the list and, maintenance maybe even at the bottom of the list? But there is a reason actually for thinking about maintenance first. Because if you think about how that landscape is going to be maintained, that will drive your plant selection in many ways. So for example, if you don't want to have to do a lot of maintenance, you should select plants that have a very nice natural form to them, so that when they grow, they have a form that will be a pleasing form, and it will fill the space that you want that plant to be in, and that it does not have to be constantly pruned or trimmed or snipped or hacked or whatever to fit in that space and to look like you want it to look. So of course you want to do your annual pruning for health reasons, but you don't want to have to constantly be hacking up the plants in your yard. So that is going to drive a lot of your plant selection. Also, you're going to want to try to pick plants that are very hardy, that you don't have to use a lot of pesticides with them. You don't have to fertilize them all the time because they're good for the soil in your area. And you don't have to maybe water them a lot because they're, drought tolerant plants. So if you think about plants in terms of maintenance first, what that does is it will automatically ensure that your yard will look good. You'll automatically take care of the aesthetics portion of the yard because even if you're not doing a lot of maintenance, it still looks good. The plants are hardy, they're doing well, the natural form looks good, and you don't have to worry so much about maintenance, and you'll still have a nice looking yard. Most people judge the aesthetics of a yard on how well maintained it looks. They don't really judge it so much on the plant material, but if it looks well maintained, the average Joe will say, yeah, that yard looks nice. It's pleasing, aesthetically pleasing. And then you don't have to worry so much about the environment either, because you have picked a plant that doesn't need pesticides, doesn't use a lot of water. And so you're going to be more environmentally healthy with that landscape also. So on the top of the list, think about maintenance, and then all those other things kind of take care of themselves. So plants for maintenance, right plant, right place. We all know that. We know the Florida Friendly #1 principle. Pick a plant that will do well in the space where you are thinking of putting it. Think about low water use, again, that naturally pleasing form, and pest and disease resistant. So not just the pesticides, but other diseases too. So I put some examples of some gardens here that kind of meet those, or planted spaces that meet those criteria. You might recognize the one that's down in the bottom left. That's actually the succulent garden at the Orange County Extension Office. So you can see that, it looks nice. You see a lot of different variety of plants there, and there's color, but it's a very low maintenance garden. And so it just shows you that you can do this. It's a particular plant type kind of that you have there, and you can do that and have a very nice garden. The other picture shows some plant material that's being used that's the appropriate size or the form for that area that look good in their natural form. If you want to have some plants that have a little kind of round mounding shape, find a plant that naturally has that round mounding shape so that you don't have to constantly trim it to have that particular form. And when you're thinking about plants for aesthetics, we think about texture, form, and color. So these are some good examples here. Form in the big agave plants there, color obviously in the wildflowers, and a lot of different textures in the picture on the bottom right. Some very coarse texture and fine texture plants. So when we think about plant texture, we think about coarse, medium, and fine. So I put the picture in on the upper right. That's a picture from the Sonoma Napa Valley Sunset Garden. And it's a beautiful garden there. And of course, it is a Mediterranean type garden being on the West Coast. But that is an example, a very clear example of the boldest, coarsest plants that you can have right next to the finest, wispiest, grassy plants. So the contrast between those two couldn't be more different. Very dramatic landscape, but an example of two different textures there. I didn't describe the medium texture one, but there's a picture right below, and those are all medium texture plants, with the exception of that one in the middle that has kind of the broad, spiky leaves. But the medium texture is any texture that's not coarse and not fine. Probably 80% of our plants fall into that category. What makes that plant bed there very interesting, even though they're all kind of the same texture, is their different colors and their different forms. So you don't have to always have a lot of different texture. You can change up some of the other aesthetic properties of plants. And the other picture that's down in the bottom right, that shows what our typical landscape usually has, and that's a mix of textures. You see some fine textures in there, some medium in the agapanthus, for example, and some coarse textures. Plant form, well, there's actually probably about 20 different plant forms, but generally we're kind of thinking more about plants that grow in a clumping form, like the grasses in the top picture on the right, or the picture directly below with the clumping form of the grasses there, and the looks like an agave there. You have plants that sprawl, grow low to the ground. You have plants that grow more upright, more stiff, like the plants in the picture on the bottom right, and then some arching kind of plants. A lot of different shrubs have that arching form. So those are just 4 examples of different forms of plant material. But you can see in all of these pictures, they are very interesting compositions because they have different form. And then let's not forget plant size. So usually the large plants are your trees and some of your bigger shrubs. And you can see in the landscape on the upper right, it's basically just larger shrubs and trees. There's very little small plants in plant beds. But then you have your very small plant material, and you can make a very dramatic statement in your yard with, for example, this large planted bowl. It's all very small succulent plants, but when you put them all together and you put them on a pedestal in a bowl, it's a very strong statement in the design. And I put the photo in the bottom left there because you want to think about size in relation to the space where you're putting the plants. So this is a good example of the latest home security device there. You can see this plant that appears to have some very sharp, pointed leaves that are sticking out right in the middle of the entry walkway into the house. I would assume it's going into there. So this is a plant that clearly was planted in a space where there's not enough room for it, unless they intentionally wanted to kind of scare their visitors and have this as their latest security device there. Not particularly a good idea, so I wouldn't recommend it. And again, a good example of wrong plant in the place. We also want to think about plant color. So the other thing, the thing about that is, you know, you can get into color theory, and I love color, so I'm totally into color theory and thinking about color, but really all you need to know is you can either use cool colors or warm colors. And you could probably tell without me even telling you which one of these is obvious, which is the cool color and the warm color. But warm colors, yellows, reds, oranges, and greens if they are kind of a yellow greenish color, yellow green or green yellow color. Cool colors, blues, purples, Greens if they're a blue green or a dark green. So what this tells you, that green is that wonderful connecting color that can go either with warm or with cool colors. And green also happens to be the color that is most pleasing to the human eye and the most calming to the human eye. So that's a good thing because we have a lot of green in our landscapes. And that, though, actually is probably why we find green to be one of the most pleasing colors in the landscape. Probably just hardwired in our brain. So the last thing I want to talk about was plant combinations. And plant combinations are that point in your design where you have to think about, okay, I've picked all my plants. I have a whole list of plants I want to use. Now, how do I know how to lay them out and combine them? Well, just think about the fact that you want to have variety, and the variety will come in your textures, your colors, your forms, and so forth. You also want to have contrast, and you want to have repetition. So those are just the three things, the three main things that you want to think about as you're deciding how to arrange these plants. So let's look a little bit closer at these design principles. Number one, contrast. So like I said, contrast can come in many different ways. So here's three different examples. You might have contrast in color. So very colorful garden here. And I also do want to point out that there's a lot of white flowers in this garden. White is the most common flower color, but the magical thing about using white is it makes all your other colors look really bright and really nice. So even if you are using other colors in your garden, try to pop in a white flower here and there. The picture over on your right, contrast is in the material, in the raised beds, but in that very dark color pedestal and urn there right in the middle, that focal point, it shows up because it's dark. It contrasts with all the other lighter green and yellow plant material. So high contrast there. And then also in the picture at the bottom, the contrast between different materials. So you have a wood boardwalk there. You have a dark shaft of basalt rock that is a fountain right there in the black color there. You have this bright kind of white sand. So contrast just in materials there. You also want to have variety. So again, we go back to variety in your forms, like the picture on the left. You see a lot of different forms in that particular garden. Variety in your color and form in that very tropical garden on the top. And then in a more typical urban landscape garden there, you see a lot of variety in the form of the plant material there. You have variety in the colors and also in the textures. So variety makes your landscape interesting. So as long as you have a lot of variety, and even if you're only picking one particular plant that you want to focus on, like bromeliads or succulents, there's still a huge variety within that plant type. Or if you want to do like a fern garden, there's so many different kinds of ferns that you could use, or a grass garden. And then repetition. Repetition is your friend in the landscape. So you can see some different examples here in the garden with the boulders, the repetition of the boulders, and then the same kind of plants tucked in and around the boulders. It unifies the whole landscape there. The picture on the left, you have the repetition in plant material, but even more importantly, you have that fence, that long line that's going through that garden, and it has a repeated shape of that scallop shape along there. That fence just unifies and ties together that entire landscape all the way across the front of that house. And then the ultimate repetition is when you pick a form, and here it's circular or sphere shaped, and you see it repeated over and over again here. You've got the hammock with the curve in it. You've got the circle in the wall. You've got the spheres on the deck. the stone spheres, and you even have concentric circles in the deck. So that's major repetition here that unifies that whole space. Okay, so last slide here, I just wanted to show you the covers of a few books that I really like a lot, I use a lot. The one that I would recommend the most that you might want to take note of is the one up in the upper right called Yards. It's one of the best books that I've ever read about landscape design for homeowners. It's by Billy Goodnick. It's a thin little book. I think it only costs like $15 on Amazon, and just an excellent little book. And also, he's a very good writer. So if you're looking for more information on design, that is the book that I would recommend that you get. Easy to read, easy to go through, not a thick book. But we also have all of our EDIS publications on landscape design. There's a whole series of them that I've written with other authors too. And this, I just put this one, 22 Ideas for a Low Care, Low Cost Landscape, just because that's one of them in the series. So I'll just leave this screen up there if anybody wants to write down the names of some of those books. But Jen, that's the end of my presentation. So I don't know if we want to take questions or.
You have a ton of questions.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Let me start up at the beginning here. Let's see. It says, will you be providing the interview list? I'm not sure what the interview list is.
Oh, for the client interviews. Yeah, I'm not sure I can, because, you know, I have that list. We use it all the time. I use it in my classes. I have the site inventory and analysis list and the client interview list that I can share with everyone. I'm not exactly sure how I do that, but I'm sure, Jen, you can tell me.
I'm not exactly sure either.
Okay, well, we'll figure it out.
Well, Emily, do you have the emails for everybody?
If they put them in when they signed in, I do have an attendee report, but I'm not sure it has emails in it.
Okay. I'll figure out a way how to do that after we're done with questions here.
Okay.
What is your preferred program for landscape design? Example in the form theme slide.
Well, so my own personal, I'm more of a naturalistic designer. I just kind of like the, not going all the way to the cottage style, but plants organized. Like I really love meandering organic pathways through the garden. But I do tend to use probably more circular or more circular forms for the hardscape, stuff like that. I'm not a huge fan of using a lot of square shapes, but I do all sorts of designs. So I don't put my personal preference into the designs I do for other people, but personally I'm kind of a more organic, naturalistic. Probably because I don't have time to do a lot of maintenance, and and I find there's less maintenance in that design.
Okay, is there a software program you can recommend that is appropriate for South Florida, one that contains native and Florida-friendly tropical plants?
You know, a few years ago, I had one of my graduate students look at and kind of test run a lot of different software programs that are on the market. We need to update that, but we honestly could not find a single one that was specifically for Florida or subtropical environments. All of them that you can buy, you know, on Amazon, or you go to Office Depot or whatever, all those programs that you can buy, they're for a national, you know, because obviously they need to sell them. So they have, some of them have huge plant databases, but they're for most of the plants I mean, we couldn't even use them here in Florida. So yeah, we couldn't find any of the ones that are commercially available that would be good, particularly good for Florida.
Okay. I have a big backyard, want to grow veggie. How to make the landscape to become veggie field, but not made the landscape ugly?
Okay, so that's a really big question and a challenge with edible plants. And in fact, the Florida Friendly Program is working on a series of EDIS publications for edible landscapes. And I do have one EDIS publication, and it is about edible landscapes. And it does have in there a lot of tips and tricks for making an edible landscape look more organized and orderly. So you can, I don't know if you guys know how to get to the EDIS publications, but if you just go on the UF homepage and then in the search box, just type in EDIS, that's EDIS. And then if you type in the search box that comes up there, if you type in my name, it'll come up with all my EDIS publications that I've written. And there is one on designing with edible plants. But a lot of it has to do with just the organization again, like using more raised beds. And if you put edible plants within other landscape beds, you just have to be aware that they're seasonal plants, and certain times of the year that they might not show up very well in the landscape. But I think the best thing to do is just go to that EDIS publication and you'll see a lot of ideas there.
Okay. When selecting the plant theme, do you prefer to check your conditions first and then select from a list? Or do you prefer to have a list of plants that are native to the area and then figure out where to place them?
So I kind of go back and forth, but I always do a site inventory and look at the conditions of the site first, because it's not just maybe plants that are native to the area, but also you have to know what, if you have a very shady yard or a sunny yard, you're going to have to consider that in your plant selection. If you have well-drained soil, sandy soil, or if you have maybe a better soil with more organic material in it, or if you have a lot of clay or whatever, you kind of have to know your soil type. And looking at other plants that already do well in your yard. So if you see plants are doing well, then you know kind of what the growing conditions that they require, and that gives you a hint as to what some of the other plants that you might be able to grow in your yard. So do your site inventory first, figure out your site conditions, and then you can match your native or non-native plants, because native plants are really great, but sometimes a native plant won't work in urban areas because the soil has been so disturbed, and they might have brought in a lot of construction sand in your yard. You might have, just not very much topsoil. I'm getting more and more people who are telling me that they having really hard time growing plants in their yards because their soil is like concrete. And so you might have to do soil amendments and stuff like that. So you really need to know what your site looks like before you can make some good plant choices.
Okay. Is there a particular technique you use when pairing plants next to each other, like 2 to 3 medium texture for every one course? And do you consider distance from walkways as a determining factor? For example, coarse texture from further distances and find a texture near a pathway?
That's a good question. And that's kind of the magical thing about texture too, is you can make a space look different. You can make it look smaller or larger, depending on where you put your coarse or fine texture plants. Typically, if you put your coarse texture plants on the, let's say the perimeter, like along your fence line in your yard, if you put coarse texture plants there, it will make your yard feel smaller. And that's because when you're looking at them, you can see more detail in the plant. So it's kind of a fool your eye trick. Your brain is kind of telling you, well, that plant is pretty close to me because I can see all the detail in it. I can see the veins in the leaves and everything. And so it'll bring a really big yard down a little bit. And so if you want that scale to feel a little more what we call human scale and make it feel a little more comfortable or intimate, put your coarse texture plants farther away in the distance. On the other hand, if you want to make a space look larger, put your fine texture plants, you know, like in a courtyard. You have a really tiny courtyard, put your fine texture plants against a courtyard wall, because then they're so small, they look like they're far off in the distance. So again, it's a fool your eye trick. It can change what you perceive to be the size of your space, even though the size hasn't actually changed. But when it comes to along a pathway, I use both. I like interesting coarse texture plants because when you're walking on a pathway, you see those plants really close to you. And so that's where I pick plants with kind of cool detail in them or interesting flower or something like that to make that walk a little bit more interesting. But you know, there's a lot of small plants that are coarse texture. They're not all big. And so you can put some really coarse texture, cool looking plants right next to the walkway too. I think about more, what does the person who's in this space see? And like patios, I try to put interesting, cool looking, flowering plants. Succulents are a good example, close to a patio where I'm sitting. So I can just look over there and I see them right there and I can kind of have fun with them, looking at them.
Okay, what do you use for the color or what do you use for the color you use in your drawings? What mediums do you prefer?
The easiest one to work with is color pencil by far. Would you agree with that, Jen?
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Color pencil is the easiest. The technique you have to learn is to just put layers of color. So color lightly with your pencil. And then if you want it a little bit darker, put another layer over that and then another layer over that. And you can also, you know, start with green and then put a little red in it or blue in it, depending on maybe the flower color of the plant. And this is when we're doing our plans by hand. Markers can be used, but they're less forgiving. Once you put marker color down, you're stuck with it. So color pencil is the easiest to work with. You can use there are some, you know, like Photoshop and some other programs that you can use, but those are more, I guess, the learning curve is a lot steeper for learning how to use that. And almost all of us learned how to use color pencils when we were in grade school. So that's what I'd go for. But buy some good color pencils, good quality color pencils, the types that artists use in their drawings, because don't buy your kids' first grade color pencil set. That won't work well.
Usually we use Prismacolor.
Yeah, Prismacolor is one of the best, and they're reasonably priced because some of the color pencil for artists can get pretty pricey, but the Prismacolor works well, and they are also reasonably priced.
Yes. I have a few more questions, but I just wanted to let you know I put a poll up on the page here. If you would take that poll for me before you leave, that would be great. Let's see. Let's see here. Let's see. How about recommending Florida-friendly plant list? We have a plant app that you can get on our website. I'll put it in the chat box here in a second while Gail's answering her next question.
And by the way, my students and I use that Florida Friendly app and the Florida Friendly, there's a book too. We use that all the time. It's our go-to plant ID book because it has a ton of information in it. besides having the picture, it'll tell you, you know, what the moisture requirements are, the soil requirements, sunshade, how tall the plant will get, how wide it will get. And there's a lot of information in there that's hard to find in other resources. I probably have about 20 plant ID books, but that's my go-to one that I use all the time.
I had one more question here. Did I lose it? Just one, Dr. Hansen, I can still remember the class you taught at the UF IFAS Extension in Orange County 2 years ago. It was excellent.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much. It's a lot of information. I think I always say at the beginning of that class, I'm going to try to teach you a semester's worth of design in 3 hours or however long it was. And so that's a pretty fast moving class also.
Yes.
So yes, we try to cram a lot of information in that.
Any book for shoreline plants, for plants around freshwater ponds?
Okay, so we also have an EDIS publication on stormwater pond plants. And so again, you can find it just by typing my name into EDIS. And it has a whole list of good plants for the water's edge and the upper bank of the shore and in the water. So it's one that we created actually when we worked with some of our extension agents on designing stormwater pond edges. And we're actually, there is another EDIS publication in there that I worked on with Giselle Neiswander is another author, and Basil, one of our faculty members in CLU. And it's a huge database that we put together with stormwater pond plants that has information on all the characteristics of the plants, and also information on where they should be planted. So 2 really good EDIS publications to look for on that. And I can't remember, I think the database just is, it says something like database of stormwater pond plants or something like that in the title.
Well, great. I think that's all the time we have and all the questions I can find in the chat box. Dr. Hansen, thank you so much for coming and teaching us about design. For everybody who wanted that, those lists, you can, actually, Emily, can you send me the chats? The chat boxes?
Yes.
Okay, leave your email in the chat box and I will be happy to send that to you from Dr. Hansen. And please stick around for the survey that you should be getting after. I'll stick around for a few minutes just to let people put their email in.
And so Jen, I'll just email you those 2 lists then.
That'd be great.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you with the next webinar, which will be next month, topic to be decided. So thank you very much for coming.
All right. Thank you, everyone.